Great Britain wants to deport migrants to Rwanda without examining their origins or asylum applications. Now 50 people have been detained and were to be flown out, but lawyers secured their release. Under the motto Secure Future, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak presented the Conservative Tories election manifesto for the early elections on July 4th. He promised tax cuts and a doubling of deportations to Rwanda. When presenting the Conservative manifesto on June 12th at the Silverstone racetrack, Sunak clearly declared immigration to be the focus of the election manifesto. While he promised to introduce a cap on immigration in order to halve immigration and then reduce it further every year, he focused on irregular migration. If the Conservatives win the election in July, deportation flights from Great Britain to Rwanda would start as early as July, as Sunak said. He was referring to his Rwanda plan, which he mentioned several times in his speech, and which is designed to deter migrants from crossing the channel illegally. Although he acknowledged criticism from the British far right that they have lost control of their borders with Brexit, migration is too high. If we are forced to choose between security and the jurisdiction of a foreign court, including the ECHR, we will always choose the security of our country, he said. Replying to a question from British tabloid The Sun, Sunak said several European countries had been inspired by the Rwanda plan. He took aim at Labour leader Keir Starmer by this, though. Normally, Keir Starmer is in favour of moving closer to the EU, but in this case he has missed the mark. Starmer, who launched the Labour Party manifesto on Thursday, has previously stated that he is against the deportation system and is instead focused on fighting traffickers. For this year, the BBC reported in mid-May that almost 10,000 people had crossed the English Channel in small boats. Previously, the numbers had fallen by around 50% between 22 and 23, from 46,000 to 30,000. And meanwhile, the UK recorded a net outflow of EU citizens in 2023, while more than 500,000 people entered the country legally from a number of countries in South Asia and Africa. In the UK, however, now 50 migrants who were in custody ahead of a planned deportation to Rwanda have been released. As the refugees' lawyers announced on Wednesday on the online service X, they are free on bail because the court assumes that there is no risk of them fleeing. The deportation of migrants who have entered the country illegally to Rwanda is a controversial project of the Conservative government of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. With the government potentially up for election election out in the general election on July 4th, it's not clear whether the deportation plans will go ahead. While Sunak has promised to implement the project if re-elected, the Labour Party, which is well ahead in the polls, has announced that it will drop it. The law firm Duncan Lewis Solicitors, which is representing the migrants, said their detention was unnecessary. The impact of the detention on the refugees is still being investigated. Many of them have been victims of torture and human trafficking in the past. In order to be able to deport the people, Sunak's government had classified Rwanda as a safe third country. The migrants are to be deported without their origin or their asylum application being examined in the UK first. The UK has already seen record numbers of refugees arriving across the Channel in the first few months of the year, as I said, and the government presented its law as a deterrent. Migration is indeed one of the key issues in the election campaign. There had already been reports of the release of migrants who had been arrested in preparation for deportation. However, the Interior Ministry, or the Home Office, did not provide any information on the number of those detained and possibly released. And there is more bad news for Sunak. 3 weeks before the election in Great Britain, there is bad news for the incumbent Prime Minister. After a brief upturn, the economy stalled in April. That means that 3 weeks before the British general election, the mixed news for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak continues. Shortly before the election, the upturn in the British economy came to a halt in April, as the Statistics Office ONS in London announced. In March, growth was still 0.4%. The sharp declines in industrial and construction production prevented the upturn from continuing this time, while service providers were able to gain ground. For Sunak, the bad economic news is piling up ahead of the election on July 4th. The unemployment rate for the period February to April also rose to 4.4%, reaching its highest level since the summer months of 2021. The number of employed people has fallen by 207,000 since the end of 23, while the number of unemployed has risen by 190,000. The last parliamentary term was dismal for employment, and today's figures are the worst since the pandemic, said Tony Wilson, the director of the cross-party think tank, the Institute for Employment Studies. Sunak, who is campaigning to voters on the basis that the economy has improved under his leadership, can at least point to a strong inflation-adjusted increases in wages. Average weekly earnings, excluding bonuses and adjusted for the consumer price index, rose 2.3% year-on-year in the 3 months to April. That's the biggest increase in almost 3 years. There was also good news with regard to inflation. Most recently, British inflation fell to its lowest level in almost 3 years in April. Consumer prices rose by just 2.3% in April compared to the same month last year. The British Central Bank is therefore very close to its inflation target of 2%. However, an interest rate cut is not expected until August at the earliest. The opposition Labour Party, which is clearly ahead in opinion polls, accused Sunak of sugarcoating the situation. Rishi Sunak claims that we have turned the corner, but the economy is stagnating and there is no growth. That was said by Shadow Finance Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves. These data reveal the damage after 14 years of conservative chaos, she said. The Conservative Tories have been in power in Great Britain since 2010, and according to opinion polls, however, Labour is likely to win next month's election. And according to them, Keir Starmer's party has a lead of around 20 percentage points over the Conservatives. An economist, asset manager at ABRDN, pointed out the limited informative value of monthly figures. Monthly GDP figures can be volatile, and one has to look at the trend over several months. In this respect, a recovery from the recession is on the horizon. That's what he told the British news agency PA. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, estimates that the British economy will grow by 0.4% this year and 1% in 2025. And the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is somewhat more optimistic about growth this year at 0.5% and next year at 1.5%. Overall, despite the slowdown in the economic recovery in April, the twin drags on economic growth from higher interest rates and inflation will continue to ease over the course of the year, said Capital Economics chief economist Paul Dales. This will give the next government some economic tailwind. Well, that could be good for Keir Starmer, because I don't know anyone who still doubts that Starmer will be the next Prime Minister. But if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.